So my name is Alex Hanna, um, and I'm a senior research scientist on the ethical AI team at Google. I'm also a sociologist by training. I was formerly faculty at University of Toronto, and that's where I know a lot of great folks at McMaster from and other domains. And once my other co-panelists join, I will I'll let them introduce themselves as well. This was originally a workshop that was given at the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency Conference called Algorithmically Encoded Bodies, or rather Identities. We're kind of using them somewhat interchangeably. Yeah, let me say a little bit more about kind of community guidelines for today. There are no bad questions. We're all here to learn, kind of resist assumptions about others, use I statements. I'd also say things like, announcing pronouns for oneself, and encourage you to put them in your profile name as well. Be kind to yourself. Some of this material might be difficult, personal, or triggering. If some of the content is too stressful, you're not going to be able to learn. So take care of yourself. You need to step out or mute or go off video. I think most of you are off video anyways. In confidentiality, we're going to engage in some small group discussions. Folks will be open to sharing what they felt comfortable sharing throughout the workshop. So please respect one another, and any personal details or specifics, keep those confidential. So the workshop goals are fourfold. First, we aim to make visible the classificatory work we're all engaged in during our own work practice. So for instance, the kind of methods by which we might categorize data in quantitative or qualitative research. Two, we want to examine the sometimes hidden ethical and political dimensions of this work and understand the impacts and potential harms that individuals from marginalized communities might encounter in this work. Three, we want to develop a set of practices that can help researchers remain self-critical in their work, creating, using, and studying classification systems. I think Dylan's in the room. Nice. Okay. Can someone make?
Yeah, we're both here.
Yay! Dylan and Emily are here. Huzzah!
Yes. Hello.
Cool.
Amazing.
Do you all want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Emily. My pronouns are they, them. I am a researcher at Google alongside Alex and Dylan. My background is in computer science, and I did a PhD in machine learning, and then ran away from that fast. And now I sort of study machine learning researchers and their kind of work practices and values and the ways in which they're going about their work in an effort to kind of shift how that work is being done and shift the kind of technologies that are being developed and produced by that field. And I am based in New York, in Brooklyn. And yeah, I think I'll pass it off to Dylan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dylan. My pronouns are they or he. I am a software engineer on the ethical AI team, and I do a lot of odds and ends software engineering work for supporting this kind of amazing research. And I also sort of dabble in other research projects focused on a lot of like human labeling and crowd computation, and the various sort of social and labor implications of that work. Yeah.
Awesome, wonderful. So we're just starting the workshop, going through the community guidelines and goals. Emily, I took some of your slides from you, so she'll come back soon.
That's great. You did fantastic.
So the agenda for today, we're going to focus today on an introductory lecture, and then Dylan's going to lead a workshop called Twerking the Individual. In part two, we're going to have two more interactive things. What's called the Choose Your Own Administrative Violence Adventure and the Classification Analytic So come to both. There's also a microsite for this. The link is here, alexhanna.github.io, algo-identity. All of the materials and the readings are linked from the site. It's also got a PDF copy of this lecture. And there's also a cheat sheet. We're going to be using some terminology for this, and you can have that. And if we were co-present, we'd pass this out. And so this is a kind of a helpful kind of way to, if we use some terminology and you want to go refer, it's a helpful little cheat sheet. Okay, now I'm going to start with an example to kick off the workshop. So let's take an example. Here's like a typical employment application, which I just got off of Google image search. You probably can't see it well, but what you can imagine what goes on the application. So full name, address, phone, citizenship, have you worked for this company? Are you authorized to work in the US? Have you been convicted of a felony, education, etc.? So it's kind of, we're pretty used to these types of employment applications. So this includes things, citizenship, work authorization, felony conviction, or graduation. And so, the classify as human, it's not a bad thing to classify, and it's something we want to emphasize from the get-go. Like, we kind of have to do this, and especially as social researchers, we're doing classifications all the time. Googled human classification, and this is actually the first thing that came up. It was really curious, so we delve into it a little bit. And we want to emphasize here that we're thinking about classification from two quote-unquote human perspectives. One is that it's natural to classify. Our minds do it as a kind of a dimensionality reduction strategy. We're trying to make sense of the world, and we like to put things in bins. The other fact is that most of what we're focused on today in this workshop is classification of humans and of social data into varying categories. So we're thinking about how we classify people's identities into boxes, how that has very particular sets of implications, and how kinds of classifications that emerge from both administrative and also corporate types of systems also impact the human. So the ways in which kind of governmental, and these are very US-centric, apologies, that we're giving this to a Canadian audience, but this is sort of, we're also sort of thinking about the ways in which existing architectures also classify us and reinforce some of those classifications. So I'm going to pass it off to Emily now. Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome, thanks. So what is a classification system? I mean, Alex has already explained this a little bit, but just at the basic level, we're just talking about a set of boxes, metaphorical or literal, into which things can be put to do some kind of work. So as Alex already mentioned, we're going to be focusing primarily on social classification systems, so things that sort people, experiences, social data in some way for some purpose. And as Alex mentioned, classification systems are, they kind of permeate our world. To classify is sort of natural, right? Like, we're doing it all of the time in our own, kind of existences and the ways in which we're making sense of the world. And they also act as ordering and simplifying structures that can serve a manifold of purposes. So just as a really clear example, like the national census and other population level survey instruments offer a really clear example of classification systems that facilitate state level administrative and bureaucratic work. And national censuses, they tend to embed this kind of classification infrastructure. For example, asking people to self-describe gender, race, ethnicity, all sorts of other kind of identity characteristics. And they provide a sort of simplified ordering principle in order to, kind of reduce and encode the complexities of one's lived experience into a kind of concise and simplified representation. And, these surveys are used for a variety of different purposes. And this is something we'll come back to at the end, is how different aims ultimately end up shaping the classification systems that get embedded in these different sorts of tools, and how those aims actually have kind of far-reaching implications. And another thing that we'll come back to kind of throughout this lecture is the ways in which classification systems, especially kind of social classification systems, often they not only sort of quantify the numbers of individuals that fall into different categories or groups, but they also over time can end up creating and constituting the very boundaries of these categories themselves. So briefly, we're going to go through and characterize some different properties of classification systems, looking at this through a lens of infrastructure, talking about the ways in which classification systems embed a perspective, and then finally looking at classification systems as technologies of power. And for this first section on infrastructure, we're going to be drawing really heavily from Boker and Starr in this book, Sorting Things Out. This whole lecture is drawn very heavily from this book, as you can kind of see in our cheat sheet, and lots of kind of citations to them. So next slide. Okay, so we draw really heavily upon infrastructural studies in order to understand classification systems. So to begin, information infrastructure can be kind of thought of as something that really permeates our world. And this is really characteristic of classification systems, right? They act as these ordering and simplifying structures that serve a kind of manifold of purposes, ranging from administrative and state building endeavors to the production of knowledge and kind of deeply structuring scientific practice. And they can be understood as infrastructure in the sense that they're embedded into and act as foundation for other social structures, tools, and technologies. They kind of create the building blocks, so to speak, of all of these other sorts of tools. And again, they provide these kind of ordering principles that simplify, complex lived experiences. And in doing so, they can shape scientific practice, shape how we make sense of the world, shape the kind of inquiries that, social researchers pursue, shape our understanding of past and current events. And in this sense, again, they kind of act as this base infrastructure that informs how everything else happens. So again, classification systems, they don't come about without a use case. Ultimately, they're always going to be socially situated artifacts whose construction is motivated by social, economic, scientific, organizational, and so on imperatives. And again, we're going to kind of keep coming back to the US Census as an example throughout this talk. But this is a really good example of categories that have kind of transformed and shifted over time to serve state aims. And Alex will kind of dig into that history in a couple of slides. But this really emphasizes the ways in which acts of classification can't be divorced from this question of who is doing the classification and what kind of organizational and institutional pressures are guiding this work. So another core characteristic of infrastructure is that it often becomes invisible when it works. So this is also characteristic of classification systems. When they work, they kind of seep into the background, right? US Census categories are an example of something where if an individual fits into a category, they're just kind of used to ticking off that box. But no classification system works for anybody. And so individuals who bump up against the boundaries of a system, for folks who don't necessarily cleanly fall into the boxes, folks for whom the system was not necessarily designed, for those individuals, the system might become highly visible and even jarring. And this is a sort of characteristic of infrastructure. Invisible when it works and is seeping into the background and into everyday routine, but highly visible upon breakdown. And this kind of visibility, invisibility kind of falls upon different people in different ways. So it's a very sort of differential breakdown. And this process of sort of sinking into the background is referred to as naturalization. And when categories become naturalized, that's when we can sort of run into the situation where they are often adopted as self-evident. So the contingencies of creation might be lost. So for example, we often see the uncritical adoption of US Census racial categories within social research, within biomedical research, within a myriad of different fields. And we see them kind of being adopted as though they're just natural categories that kind of exist out there in the world. The social and political contingencies and histories of their creation can be lost when they are just being adopted in this sort of routine way within other sorts of work practices. Okay, so classifications are simplifications, obviously. They provide a way of ordering the world to serve some purpose. And so with this, comes a very natural observation that there is just no universal ordering of the world, right? So any given classification system is going to arise from a particular set of kind of local negotiations. And this also means that classification systems are going to inherently have ethical and political dimensions. They're always going to privilege one point of view and potentially silence another. And this isn't inherently a bad thing. It's sort of inescapable, but it does imply that there are often ethical choices when you choose to adopt a particular classification system, when you choose to order the world in a certain way. And these choices carry with them a lot of kind of rippling and far-reaching implications, and so require critical consideration and examination. Okay, and then I already mentioned kind of, institutional and individual imperatives often end up being embedded into classification systems because they are constructed by people within particular situated contexts and with particular aims. Okay, next slide. Oh, and actually passing it right off to you now, Alex.
Wonderful, thanks, Emily. So the third point, talking about institutional imperatives, we can think about the ways that practices of counting and sorting are central to state building. This is sort of the central kind of argument that a number of folks have made, kind of chiefly amongst them, people like James Scott have talked about the kind of idea about how counting things, even the processes of saying counting trees in scientific management of agriculture, as well as kind of more complicated kind of aspects of the development of surnames are a way and a sort of technology of state building. There's also this sort of idea that it's grown within social sciences that kind of imperatives to count and sort people grew out of directly colonial projects. The idea of kind of counting colonial subjects and understanding, especially people who were non-European, non-Western, and counting them for the purpose of governance in colonial projects. Those projects themselves also necessitated racial classifications and the kind of development of kind of a racialized notion of classification for those purposes. So in North America, pseudoscientific classifications were to certain types of bodies lent support to white supremacist projects. So physiognomy, I can never pronounce the word, and phrenology gave rise to pseudoscientific grounded mechanisms of classification. Things like hand measurements or head measurements and calipers were used to claims that certain bodies were prone to violence or prone to sort of non-rational thought. On this slide, we've shown a particular project of this sort. Francis Galton, who's kind of considered one of the fathers of eugenics, in his composite portraiture of a photography technique that created average portraits are reported to be characteristic of different personality types. And sort of, you can see the sort of like things that lend itself to criticality. Yeah, Allison's calling out the Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Gould. That is a kind of a good detail of that. And there's also many good books. Zuberi's book on Thicker Than Blood, as well as the book on kind of race and research methods, white logic, white methods, edited by Zuberi and Bona Silva. They're both sociologists. So we're seeing a rise in this kind of in modern times. You know, a lot of people criticized AI and computer vision as a subfield of AI, as kind of reinforcing these kinds of modes of physiognometry and phrenology. And so, for instance, this 2016 paper published here by Wen Zhang wanted to claim that there was doing automated inference on criminality from face images. So, you know, they trained a vision model and claimed that they were able to basically detect who was kind of a criminal or not just from face images. A question in the chat, Alex, how do we know what we are doing in algorithmic classification is not pseudoscientific? That's a really good question. And I think one of the purposes of this workshop writ large is to kind of cultivate in you kind of a kind of sense of reflexivity and kind of concern on like what is pseudoscientific and what is more justified. And so I think as we go along with this, we can talk, but like keep that, let's come back to that question throughout the workshop and we'll revisit it throughout, because I think that's probably one to keep top of mind. But thank you for the great question, Matthew. Another example of this is Faceception, which is a real startup that self-describes itself as the tool for profiling people and revealing their personality based only on their facial images. And so they have this kind of model, which they, you know, say they have these image sources and collect these images, have some descriptors, do some personality profiling, and then they give a personality scorecard. So this is pretty, you know, abhorrent. But there's also a bit of a cottage industry on emotion categorization or personality categorization, and folks like Luke Stark have written on this, who's actually at Western Ontario, so another Canadian. But even in the most kind of egregious cases, you know, kind of, you know, those were sort of phrenology in the limit, sort of the outliers. This project of doing classification is kind of embedded in many types of, you know, kind of standard state building projects. And those projects are tied to particular types of racial projects. For instance, Pew Research did a wonderful graphic on the changing categories on the US Census, and how that's shifted in the past 200 or so, 250 years in the history of the US. And so you can see even from this basic page, this shift from originally in 1790, and text is kind of small, so I can read. In 1790, this US Census as encompassing free white males, free white females as one category, then all others in the residual categories as all other free persons and slaves. Now, of course, this is much more complicated in 2020, where there's a category for white, Black or African American, American Indian, or Alaska Native, and then many categories that encompass individuals of Asian descent, Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and other. There's also a lot of change in how people, you can play with this tool, it's really fascinating to see. One thing that isn't noted on this, it's noted in small text near the top, is that from the 1960s onward, people could choose their own race. That was a classification of who was actually being able to choose their own. And in 2000, prior to that, the census taker, the census enumerator, would make some kind of a visual assessment of the individual. And then from 2000 onward, Americans could be recorded in more than one racial category in census forms. So you're seeing this sort of being more complicated instead of the aims of and the kind of political dimensions of things change. Okay, so we've been talking a lot and we want to take a second to check your understanding. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do a quick pair and share, very quick, 5 minutes. So what we're going to do is I'm going to stop sharing because I am going to reshare so you can see it in breakout rooms. Oh, actually, no, that didn't work like that. Okay, I'm going to reshare and then change it once. This is very new. Zoom is great. So say you're just designing a survey to assess the effectiveness of some social policy intervention that's supposed to address the gender disparity in child rearing labor in your city. You need to obtain some information about gender. So one question is, what are the different considerations of gender measurement? And then two, and one thing I want you to pay attention to is sort of, this is about child rearing labor. And so what may be some other considerations in thinking about measurements of gender? Two, what are possible ways of designing this question? And that's where the rubber hits the road. If you're actually going to put this on the survey, what would this look like? Yeah, so let's just go around. Let's get like a quick 3 responses. So in answering the questions, what are kind of different considerations that y'all were thinking about here? And feel free to just unmute and go. Yeah, go ahead.
So my group was discussing something like, we're kind of debating between the idea of putting multiple gender identity, like a laundry list of gender identities in, versus having one, maybe 3 or 4 majority ones, and then something like other, and ask people to qualitatively describe who they are. And then, but there is like pros and cons on either side. We don't want to limit people to categories. We don't really want to other people into the other option. But on the other hand, it's also going to pose a huge difficulty or challenge to data analysis at the end if we have thousands of surveys.
So yeah, that's a really thoughtful kind of set of considerations in having, and I liked how you said thinking about like actually clicking other and feeling othered. Dion, am I saying your name correctly?
Yep.
Great.
Hi. So Jacob and I were talking about possible ways of designing the question. So one of the ideas is perhaps talking to the actual people who will be classified and talking to the people of how they like to identify themselves rather than a top-down, go from bottom-up consideration. There was also the idea of a lot of times, so Jacob was explaining an idea of binary and how you are something or you are not something. Whereas I think Jacob mentioned that a more human experience, let me know if I'm misrepresenting your ideas, by the way. A more human experience might be what we have rather than what we are. So we have the identity of being female, but I also, and this ended up coinciding with intersectionality, where gender is not just I am female, but for me, I'm female, I am of East Asian descent, I am of second generation, and how all those things work into considering gender disparity in child rearing.
This is great. And I love 2 things you said. One, about talking to people first and talking about self-identification, and 2, the kind of intersectional angle in this and thinking about how that kind of plays into child rearing practice. Can you get one more person real quick? Yeah, Megan.
Yeah, so and then one other thing was that the direction of the policy itself will inform how the survey should be designed. So what types of interventions did the policy include? Like what areas of social and professional life did it target? And what types of structures exist in those domains. And so all of those things will also have to be considered in designing the follow-up survey, and how those, categories will be laid out.
Yeah, really, really good thing to point out. It depends on what the policy has been. All right, I want to talk about this more, but we're like running quick. So like just a quick kind of thing, like there's sort of other kind of discussion. This is sort of like an open discussion within social sciences. For instance, the Genius Group at the Williams Institute that focuses on LGBTQ health and law has suggested kind of a two-step approach. For instance, I asked assigning sex at birth and current gender identity. But there have also been people that have suggested kind of like thinking about different kinds of metrics, thinking about measuring how one sees themselves and then how one is reflected in other kinds of presentation, and for this to be an ordinal scale kind of scale, as well as asking for sex at birth, including folks who are born with an intersex condition, as well as, and then current gender. And this is an open question. These aren't definitive. There's actually been a lot of criticisms of both of these, especially kind of coming from people that are kind of implicated in trans studies and queer studies, as well as what Dion raised, sort of people who are not in a majoritarian racial category. But yeah, that'll hopefully prime you for the next exercise, which I will now hand off to Dylan. And Dylan, do you want to go ahead and present? I'll start presenting. While you're setting up, I'll respond quickly to Dina. How do we do this without a survey and asking people, i.e., how do we infer identities from social media profiles? Really good question. As someone, I know, Dina, you work a lot with social media data, as do I. And I think it can be kind of I do think that's a bit of a dangerous game to do kind of inference from social media profiles. I know companies do it all the time. And there's a temptation to do this as well, kind of, especially in social media research. But I think it does present a possible, there is a possibility of misclassification in understanding what the dimensions or what kind of implications for one's analysis that can have there. I know there's been efforts to sort of do things where, sociologists of science, for instance, have looked at like disparities in like how individuals, like who was producing science, Michelle, you've done this work, in political science and citations. And one scholar I know at University of Michigan, Jeff Lockhart, for instance, just put out a huge survey to actually have a database of how people identify, both gender-wise and racially, as a means to sort of ameliorate this, at least in studies of science. Yeah, okay, let me pass it off.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, cool. So I'm just gonna quickly go through some concepts that can help us understand the effects of classification systems, and in particular, the effects on individuals who might exist in the margins of a particular system. Next slide. So the concept of a residual category, I think, can be really helpful here in terms of understanding who a system was designed for and who it wasn't. And residual categories here just refers to the sort of not elsewhere classified categories that don't fit into a particular classification schema. And because no classification system is universal, we're always going to have instances that kind of fall through the cracks. And residual categories might not be obvious to everyone, right? So this kind of harkens back to this idea that infrastructure is sort of visible when it fails, but it doesn't fail for everyone, and it doesn't fail for everyone equally. And residual categories can be a useful concept, the sort of generative concept to think about, because they can inform our understanding of the conditions of creation of a given classification system. So for example, thinking about what residual categories are for a particular system can give insights into what might have been taken for granted when it was being developed, what might have been assumed, what might not have been considered. And residual categories can also inform our understanding of harm, since they can indicate patterns of inclusion and exclusion. Of course, this is going to be very dependent on the context and aims of a given system, but this can be an important piece that informs this understanding. Next slide. So there's a couple of key questions that we can ask of a classification system in relation to this notion of residual categories. One key question is just, what are the residual categories and why are they residual? And there's a bunch of different reasons why a category might be residual and how this might have come about. So for example, an object or a person or an experience or so on might kind of fit into 2 or more categories in a schema that requires a single response. So for example, if you have an individual who is taking a survey and asked to self-identify into a set of racial categories, if that individual is multiracial and that categorization system requires a single response, that person then would kind of fall into this residual space. Also, the structure of a categorization system, it might have limited choices, and you might just have somebody who just doesn't fall into one of the buckets. So you might have a non-binary individual who is faced with gender options, male, female, and there's just kind of, no option for them. You might have something that's kind of too complicated to describe and might just strain the technical capabilities of a system. So the individuals might kind of be, who are constructing the system might be aware of a limitation, but it's just kind of practically difficult to build in. And you might have sort of a data collector who doesn't quite have the relevant information to understand a particular category or understand how someone's lived experience might fit into a system. So, you might have somebody who's trying to classify another individual into a gender group or a racial group, and you might have markers that change over time. And, a survey data collector might just be kind of unable to capture that based on the framework that they're working within. And you might also just have knowledge that is shifting over time. A lot of the times we're dealing with really complex social categories, and our understanding of those categories, even for folks who are kind of deeply steeped kind of in particular groups themselves, like things can shift over time. And so you can end up with different sorts of residual categories emerging due to that. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about how residual categories can arise. I should have said next slide as I was talking over this. Okay, next slide. So another thing that's important to ask is what happens to the residual categories. So I talked about this a little bit already, but people might be sort of forced into one of the available categories. And in this case, we might just lose any signal about residuality. So again, a really concrete example, you might have a survey that asks people to identify as male or female, and you might have non-binary respondents who either just don't respond to your survey or kind of put themselves into one box or another, and then you're just losing signal about this population. So it can just kind of get lost. And sometimes residual categories might kind of get captured, but just get lumped into an other box, right? You might have a set of categories that are, kind of clearly defined for a bunch of different people, and then just literally an other box that people can check. And here you're still losing signal, but you might have a little bit more information that, okay, there is, some other group. Okay, next slide. So another key question to ask is just what are the consequences of residuality? And this is going to be specific to a particular context of use of a classification system. Something that can be important to think about here is that being well represented by a system can often, it kind of comes with increased visibility, but visibility is not always a universal good. Right? So visibility to administrative bodies can be really critical for individuals who are trying to access basic services and resources, and visibility can be really important in social research when that research is going to inform policies and distribution of resources and so on. But visibility also has deep implications for surveillance by the state and other actors. And so, if you're an individual from a kind of vulnerable or already kind of heavily surveilled group, then invisibility can sometimes be a way of, kind of subverting these systems and protecting oneself. So this is very sort of context dependent, this question of, whether visibility is something that an individual or a group might want. Okay, next slide. Okay, so torque is another useful concept, and this is a concept that Dylan's going to come back to in the exercise later in this workshop. And it's a concept that can help understand the effects that classification systems might have on individuals. So there's a concept from Boker and Starr that sort of invokes this metaphor of force to describe this tension that can be introduced in the lives of individuals who find themselves sort of being twisted and contorted by misalignment of a classification system. Maybe misalignment between their own lived experience and a set of categories that they're being put into, or kind of multiple overlapping classifications that might not, kind of have a clear coherence. And this concept of torque kind of describes the ways in which, people have to kind of contort themselves often into a logic that was not designed for them. So really clear example of this is sort of trans and non-binary individuals who might find themselves kind of caught in really complicated and intersecting webs of classification that structure a lot of administrative infrastructure, and individuals might be forced to sort of, torque themselves and fit themselves into what are often very rigid and narrow gender categories. And there's this need to do so in order to just access basic services and resources. And this is Dean Spade has coined this term, sort of administrative violence, to kind of describe the systemic effects of these sorts of systems. Next slide. Okay, so then the final thing to kind of touch on here is just this concept of agency. And again, this is sort of a running theme throughout this lecture. Classification systems are sites of power. And so we really need to be asking who is doing the classifying and for what purpose. And sometimes agency can be really critical. It often is. And the concept of agency comes in when we're thinking about kind of giving individuals control over what categories are used, and when. This can also be really important when we're thinking about, ensuring that classification systems are serving different communities and are not being used for kind of extractive and surveilling purposes. Okay, so I'm now pass it off to Dylan for this final exercise of the day, torquing the individual.
So we're going to do an exercise called torquing the individual. So suppose some government has decided to start creating formal records of who an individual's immediate family members are. So there are like a bunch of different potential policy proposals or implications of this. For example, access to medical care, saying like your immediate family members are able to, say, access your medical records or visit you in the hospital in an emergency, something that exists in many forms today. Implications in citizenship, proposed policies that say all of your immediate family members are granted the same citizenship as any one member, and that's sort of the limit. Potential housing policies saying, we'll give tax incentives to individual families who are trying to buy sort of larger homes, or ways to sort of like incentivize different behaviors with families. Could also imagine, implications in policing saying, if we find that one family member has been convicted of some crime, we're going to subject the rest of the family to increased surveillance because we believe that, they're more likely to be sort of committing similar crimes or something like that. So these things might be like sort of, as Emily was saying earlier, things that you may want or things that you may sort of shy away from or actively not want, depending on the potential policies. So lots of these things are sort of being thrown around. And in this hypothetical, this is the sort of prototypical family that's presented, where people will have marriages, and within those marriages, they'll have children. And so this proposed definition is given as sort of a first pass. This is how we want to legally define families. Siblings are someone who shares the same parents as you, will have the concept of legal adoption or sort of biological parenthood. your child is somebody that's either your direct offspring biologically or someone you've legally adopted. Your spouse is someone you have a legal marriage certificate with and you can only have one. And your co-parent is somebody who you have biological offspring with. So these are sort of all of the different family relations that have been proposed to be formally defined. So we're going to jump to the fun part. I want to break us up into groups of maybe like 4 or 5. We could even do like 3-ish and make one copy of this Google Doc per group. Oh, thanks, Alex. So why don't we make breakout groups, and within each breakout group, you can make a copy of this Google Doc. And I think what I'm going to have everybody do is just read through section 2 of this doc that will give you a bunch of different sort of prototypical families and little diagrams illustrating these different families. And the idea is that within these sort of prototypical families, there are relationships that are describable by this diagram. And these are the obvious or important distinctions in this world. And relationships that aren't described by this diagram are considered irrelevant personal details, which will hopefully make sense once you're able to look at them. So I'll break us up into groups. There are sort of descriptions in the doc, and I'll assign each group like one of the different sort of family groups and prototypical family structures, and talk through some of the discussion questions about how these different family structures might choose to like change the ways in which they live their lives in order to better meet this original definition 1 of what a family structure is based on these different proposed policies. So for example, I think in the doc I have like, if the sort of medical visitation policy were proposed, how might your prototypical family change the things that they do and change the structure of their life in order to either better meet this definition or sort of try actively not to meet this definition. So I know we're pretty short on time and we didn't have a ton of time to sort of talk through things, but I was just wondering if anybody from any of the groups wanted to share sort of anything that they talked about their sort of prototypical family or any of the choices that they might have made or impacts that might have had.
Okay, I can present what our group said. So we took actually example 4 and then we took prototype 5 after it. So it became more complex after that. Because in prototype 4, we suggested that maybe they can adopt G, like, or I don't remember the letter. So yes, let me bring the file. So in prototype 4, we said that E and F might adopt G, and then G would become family member, and then problem is solved. Then when we were thinking about group 5, that will be a more complex problem because G now is not considering themselves as member of the family, so they might reject adoption. And this is actually where we stopped talking about like things because we're not sure if they are going to, if some members of the family consider someone else as member, but they do not consider themselves as part of this family, then the issue will be more complex. And there was also the idea of considering themselves like as the grandparents will be by default guardians of G because like they are the grandparents simply. So it might not be an issue. We're not sure about this thing, how it happens, but it could be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in the chat, our prototype didn't have unilateral feelings of family. Absolutely. It's like particularly, I think, salient if you're being asked to define something that doesn't necessarily have like a particular meaning, like suddenly being given meaning and needing to sort of figure out what that meaning is going to be based on the implications around you is super real.
In our group, Michelle brought up a really, really good point that is relevant to what we're experiencing now, where countries closed off their borders to anyone who's not a citizen. And so I believe for Michelle's example, in a long distance relationship, someone was considering marrying someone else in order to become a citizen so that they could see their partner. So that's like a really, really relevant right now to what we're experiencing.
Absolutely. Yeah, state projects of classification in many ways radically reshape people's very intimate personal relationships. As yeah, anyone in any kind of like international like relationship, queer and trans relationships, polyamorous relationships, like all sorts of dynamics.
I guess it also, one thing worth considering is the affectiveness of it. So the affect of it, how do people feel about being invalidated or feeling like they have to change or feeling like I am different from the norm? That othering feeling is, there's so many dimensions.
Absolutely.
I know we're at time now. Thanks for this. I kind of got off to a slow start, but thank you for attending this first part of this workshop. Michelle shared the link, or sorry, Allison shared a link for part 2 of the workshop and see upcoming events. And then this is recorded. So thank you for sticking with us to the end, and hopefully we'll see you all on December 3rd.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for persevering through the technical difficulties as well. I know that can be really frustrating. So really, really appreciate you folks coming here to share the information with us. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much.